Hello, friends, and welcome to this Saturday evening's discourse or time of sharing on magnetism in the time of adversity. And again, as we always say at the beginning of these, we're discussing ways in order to keep our magnetism strong, either by strengthening it from within or, in a sense, maybe plugging the holes. And I think that our topic for today is more in that vein of learning how to plug those holes, those things that weaken our magnetism. And I chose the topic today of criticism and or how to accept criticism in the right spirit. And I was jokingly thinking, just as I was coming online, he says, well, if you're going to give a talk, you might as well give a talk about a subject that you know something about, which and maybe I know something about it on both sides. Giving criticism to other people, unfortunately, sometimes, many times unwanted and in the wrong time, in the wrong place, but also maybe the karma of that is receiving criticism. And so consequently, I thought I'd share a few thoughts on that today, because we have to be able to receive criticism in the right spirit. Because if we don't, and you know what happens if you're criticized. I think it's not unique to me. When we're criticized, what do? We feel a sense of oh, that guy doesn't know what he's talking about. Or there's some ways where it pinches us in some way, or maybe we feel a little hurt about that. Oh, that person doesn't understand what I'm trying to say. Or you start making excuses and, oh, this is this or that. And it's an emotional reaction is what that is. If you really are honest with yourself, which is absolutely necessary if we're going to be devotees to be able to get strong on this, we have to be self-honest and see, why am I reacting? And that's one of the first signs that we've got a little work to do, is if you find yourself getting upset when somebody criticizes you or criticizes something that is dear to you or whatever, it's close enough to you that you start to get upset about that, or you get defensive about it, and you begin to, naturally, one thing leads to another. Next thing you know, you're arguing about it. And you could say that probably that's one of the first signs, or a sure sign, that you've got an emotional investment here that is a little bit unsteady. There's a certain defensiveness there. You're unsure of yourself. There's a lack of confidence. You're too close to it. And what we want to do, of course, is get to that point when we can look at things honestly and clearly, because criticism itself, in and of itself, is not a good or bad thing. It's, when we're giving criticism to somebody else, we're always saying, well, I didn't mean anything. I was being totally impartial. Now, how true that is subject to debate, really, because our criticism of others tends to often be coming up from some issue within ourselves. But nevertheless, properly given criticism can be useful. And you are doing something and you ask something, well, what do you think about it? And more often than not, you don't really want an honest answer. You want support. Somebody say, oh, that's great, Jay, you're doing a great job. But no, I really want you to tell me, what do you think? And if you have that relationship with another person or somebody who can advise you to give you criticism, and in the highest sense, this is what we're looking for in the disciple, is looking for from the guru, of course. If the guru, in the set, if master could not have told Swami honestly and forthrightly where he lacked, the disciple makes a wall. What good is the guru then? He can't enter in and take charge of one's life, so to speak. And so this is what we do with ourselves, is if we put a wall around ourselves to protect ourselves from the world itself, giving us feedback. And isn't that really what criticism is? It's a feedback. But if we're put that wall up, we basically seal ourselves off from the larger reality in which we live. And we don't want to do that, because in the highest sense, in the best sense, criticism is a feedback mechanism to tell us if we should go left, we should go right, whether we should do something this way, that way. But of course, in common situations, it's not involved that impersonal. It's giving us feedback, all right, but it's not always well-informed feedback sometimes. And somebody said that idiot doesn't know. They're saying to me, I don't know what I'm doing. And in my mind is thinking, well, that idiot doesn't really know what he's talking about. He's misinformed. And we don't get very far that way, do we? No. So we have to learn to be able to receive criticism. Well, one, we should also know how to give criticism in a positive way. But here today, we're talking about receiving it, being able to receive it with a calm and even-minded temperament, to be able to receive it and in the best spirit. And if you will find will happen is if you can learn to receive criticism from the world calmly and even-mindedly, the world itself tends to put a filter and doesn't feed you as much of that negative criticism that's unthinking, unwarranted than otherwise, because somehow that feeds on somebody who's overly sensitive and is somehow attracting that type of criticism to themselves. But when you become very centered in yourself and you can impartial and you find that you don't react, well, then the world doesn't push your buttons quite so much with that in that way. But we have to understand that criticism is natural. There is not anybody, I don't think, that has not been criticized in one way or another. Even a hermit living out in the desert is criticized. But the only advantage the hermit has, of course, he doesn't ever hear it because he's out there by himself. But somebody got something to say about him. If they hear about him, what's that guy doing out there for whatever reason? And if you look at the lives of all great souls, great people, they were criticized. Who did anything in life of worth, they received criticism. You pick anybody, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Jesus Christ, the great masters, Paramahansa Yogananda. He came to the United States and he was criticized. People would, make fun of him, of course. He's a foreigner, odd clothing, odd accent, foreign religion, what's he doing? And of course, the newspapers, eventually turned against him, and because in sensational journalism, and he was, somewhat disappointed at that time when the newspapers even turned against him in the mid-20s. And he says, why, Divine Mother, why did you send me here? And then, that you could see that thought, why? And then Divine Mother sort of consoled him, said this was his duty in life to do that. And that was, you might say, master speaking on the human level, but underneath he knew, and he was one with the Divine Mother. Swami Kriyananda was tremendously criticized when he was discharged from Self-Realization Fellowship. They said, you don't criticize such a degree that they told him, no, we don't want you representing Master's teachings ever again after you leave here. And Swami actually, for the first year or two, he tried to follow these instructions out of a sense of loyalty. I think it was a somewhat misplaced loyalty by that time, but nevertheless, he tried his best. But his heart wouldn't allow him to do that. I mean, would he have really been following a higher dharma to follow that criticism and take it in? No. But he tried, but eventually, of course, his path led him to being able to share. And he realized that he had to share for his own welfare and to be in tune with his guru's instructions. And he went out and started sharing. But that criticism never went away. It never went away. It was always there. And so we have to understand that because somebody is criticizing us does not mean that we're doing something wrong. We don't know if it's our fault, the other person's fault, but we do have to be open to being able to receive the world's feedback to what we're doing. Because otherwise we run the danger, as I said, of sealing ourselves off from the world, because we never know. And even Swami used to say, I mean, honestly, Swami didn't always want criticism. And I learned this. He would write something, and he'd say, well, what do you think? And my mind was very literal. Well, Swami, I think this, and he wouldn't like that at all because that wasn't what he was asking at that time. Now there was a place for that, but it wasn't often. I took me time to learn to read the signals of when was the right place to give those kinds of comments. He was asking for a sense of support and let's get this thing rolling, let's get the energy and creative thinking he was looking for from me or from other people at that time. But then later on he would say, well, yes, what about this or that? Time for that. So we have to learn how to be able to judge on when we're receiving and when we're giving criticism. What is the appropriate time and the appropriate reaction? Some people we have to take seriously. If somebody comes up and gives us criticism, we have to be open to be able to receive that. And you can tell to a large degree by your own inner reaction to it. And we'd have to first calm that inner reaction to criticism outside, and then we can begin to see, is this a valid criticism or is it really another person's problem that they're just they have their own motives, you might say. And it's not a valid criticism, but we don't want to just be reactive to it. Now, there are people that will be critical of things that you've done. If you look back in your past, you've done things and people will identify you with those things, and the criticism will follow you. Even though you're a different person than you were 10 years, 20 years ago, that criticism will follow you. And there's a tendency to want to just not accept that. And I have a story of a friend of mine who came up with a very good antidote to that. Now, I should say first, before I tell that story, that Master said, don't tell your faults, personal faults. Don't broadcast them to other people, saying, oh, I'm just really not very good. In a sense, to deflect the criticism before it happens, you might say. Don't tell your faults to other people, because the Master said oftentimes if they're of negative intent, they're going to use them against you. Don't do that. And the second thing is, if you start telling your faults to everybody, you in a subtle way are beginning to identify with those faults and thinking that was really you. It was just something, you might say, a virus that caught you for a moment, if to use that term, and it passed through, but that wasn't who you were. So don't identify with that, but he said, don't broadcast them out widely. Yes, to somebody of wisdom who you're trying to receive advice from, now that might be, appropriate, but use your discretion wisely. Well, the story I want to tell is about a friend of mine who, unfortunately, he died a few years ago. So this goes back in time. But he was a neighbor of mine at Ananda Village and lived right down the road a little bit. And he'd been there a long time. I knew his wife from the early 1970s because she was an Ananda member at that time. She went off on her own direction, but married this fellow, and we kept in touch and we're friends over that time. Now, this fellow, it was interesting. He, in his youth, was a bank robber. That's how he made his living, you might say. He robbed banks. And he had a partner, but finally, he was caught. And he spent 10 years in a high security prison with that. And he said, I learned many lessons in that prison. And but some people go sour when they're in prison and become bitter and hard. And he didn't. He went the opposite direction. He became a nice fellow and people respected him. He had a good personality. He was funny, for one thing. And so he came out of prison, and then he started trying to find a job. And the prison authorities, after incarceration, were helping him find this job, placement service, put him in a job. And he found that he would go into a job and he would try to say, well, my past is done. I'm not leaving it behind. I'm leaving it behind. I'm not going to talk about it. He went there, and so he'd start a job, and a little time would go by, and pretty soon people would come to know that this guy was an ex-convict. He was an armed robber, and he had a pretty shady background. And people would distance themselves from him. And if the boss didn't know this, he came to know that. And pretty soon, it turned sour in the workplace. And people didn't want him there. And he would lose a job and it just wasn't working out. Boss would say, it's not really working out. Maybe you find another position. And so he did this, 3 times or so. He kept losing until finally he was getting very discouraged by this. He hit upon a creative solution. What he did, he went to a job interview, and the fellow was interviewing him for the job. Says, "Well, okay, here I see. What's your experience? Your job experience? I see you. What were you doing here in your 20s?" And my friend says, "Oh, that period I tried robbing banks, but it didn't work out." And now imagine you're interviewing a fellow and he tells you that. The guy would stop and he'd say, "What?" He says, "Oh yeah, I was a bank robber, but I had to move on to something else because I spent 10 years in prison." And the guy, what was the guy the interviewer would naturally, with the interview, because my friend would say it very lightheartedly and, openly and cheerfully. And the guy would start asking, "Well, what happened?" And my friend would then start telling the story. "Well, this happened, that happened, that happened." And he would engage with the fellow, the boss, and the boss got to know him and thought, "This is a really nice guy." And he would hire them. And then when he got there, people would say, "Yeah, I tried the bank robbing profession and it just didn't work," and he distanced himself emotionally from it. He had no identification from it. And he approached it in a lighthearted way. "It wasn't me, it was that other guy. I used to be, but he's gone." And he didn't hide. He didn't hide it, but he didn't advertise it either. He just when it was brought to his attention, he was able to distance himself from that self-identification for that. And when criticism comes to us, I think we have to be a little bit like that. "Yeah, I goofed up. Yeah, that was a joke, wasn't it? I really messed that one up. But I've learned, and now I'm going forward." And if you start getting defensive, you don't ever put it behind you. And so, be light with yourself, and then you might try something like that. In other words, you're taking the offense rather than being defense, and you find that people then they just back off, and then because it's not bothering you, so why should they let it bother them? And I think this attitude of non-attachment, might say, to yourself, to your past, to your faults, to whatever it is. Non-attachment to it is a key to being able to receive criticism, because it was just something that happened. You could say it was Divine Mother's fault. She put me in this weird situation, and I blame her. Now, I'm saying do that in a good spirit. I'm not, I think you know what I mean here. But being that distance from it rather than holding on to it and trying to protect it, trying to protect something of yourself. And you find that that's going to fester. You're not going to be able to be successful with that. And so you join the ranks, just accept it. You've joined the ranks of souls that have been criticized, are being criticized. Everybody is criticized unless they don't have any energy and they never did anything. And I think if a person's not being criticized, they're probably not trying hard enough. In a sense, if you're really trying something to do something, you have to accept that. I remember a little story. That reminds me of a story. There was a monk in Self-Realization Fellowship of disciple of a master, and the other monks said, "We're praising him because he never had any sexual temptation." And Master kind of chuckled. He says, "Yes, that's because he doesn't have enough energy to have any temptation." and you see, if you're going to do anything in life, you're going to put out energy, but you then don't get attached, and you maintain a certain distance and are able to turn left or right at a moment's notice. And this is what I noticed in the life of Swami Kriyananda. People, they say, when now here it is many years later, and people look back, "Oh, Swami was so wise, he did all these things that worked." Well, that's because we don't talk about much of the stuff that didn't work. You forget it. and because it's gone. Those things didn't work, but out of those things not working, he learned. So that when he did it again, he tried again the next time, it did work. And so you have to be able to accept failure, or else you're not going to do anything. And if you fail, you can believe that somebody's going to come along and remind you of it. It's just the way it goes. And so don't glorify your past failures, but on the other hand, just let them go and try again, because it's important. What are you doing now? What are you doing now? So just some points about accepting criticism in the right spirit. One, I said, don't be defensive. Don't be defensive, and don't try to push it aside, or don't get reactive to it. Say, okay. The second thing is, though, think about it. Is it true? Because people are going to criticize you sometimes for things that are not true. Or more likely, it's because it was misunderstood. So is it true? But if it is true, you have to have the willingness and the courage to admit it to yourself. Yeah, that didn't work so well. But don't be ashamed of it. You say, change course, and you're trying to fix it. Secondly, if it's not true, well, why should it bother you if it's not true? Sometimes I would say, don't start justifying yourself. Somebody starts hammering on you, don't feel you have to start defending, because oftentimes when things aren't true, they don't stick, and they take care of yourself, and you end up looking bad if you start being defensive of everything. It doesn't make you look, I guess leave it at that. It doesn't make you look too good if you're always defending yourself. Let it go. Life will defend you in its own time if it's worthy and needs to be done. The other thing, though, if it's misunderstood, there is a lesson there. You probably are somewhat complicit in perhaps not explaining what you did. Maybe you need to change your tactics so that other people in the future will understand what you're trying to do. So there, even in that, if it was misunderstood, it's a lesson, can be a lesson for you there to do a better job next time of trying to make yourself clear. But don't let the criticism slow you down, because even if you're mistaken and the criticism is right, it's better to try to do something and fail than to do nothing at all. And if you look at the great people throughout life, throughout history, you'll see that they tried and tried and tried again. I mean, Churchill's considered a great leader of England, but the fellow was pretty much a failure in many things he did up until the time of the Second World War came along. But and it's the same way with many. The time was not right for what they had to offer, but then they kept trying, and the time was right, and then they broke through of their persistence. Another radical thing to do is, if you really did make a mistake, Master said, don't hold on to them, but that doesn't mean you might not want to apologize once in a while too. Because sometimes people will, they're waiting for some acknowledgement that, yeah, you did blow it. And especially if you, personally, I don't think you need to, make front page apologies, but that it does, if some individual is, that you're wrong, just go and apologize. And you find that it does wonders. Oftentimes it turns energy completely around. And so I think in the sense, learn to accept criticism. And if you can start to perfect that trait of being calm and just like whatever comes, just absorb it like the ocean absorbs all the rivers, and it doesn't change its level, and it just keeps absorbing. You can be like that. Just absorb what comes to you and deflect it here and there if tactically it's necessary to do that. But as you do that, and the lesson you begin to learn is it helps you to learn how to give criticism to others in a positive way, because you learn the lesson. Ooh, that person is criticizing me and it's really not nice. Well, probably maybe you have the karma of having done something just like that. So learn that lesson so that when it comes your turn to offer criticism, it's in a positive vein. You know, there's positive criticism when asked and at the appropriate time. And there's negative criticism, which is just a venting of a person's negative emotions. And they have an agenda. You have to accept it what comes, but do what is appropriate to the situation. It doesn't, Master said, don't be a doormat. In other words, don't let somebody walk all over you. That's not right. That's not being dharmic either. He says, but on the other hand, and is, so you not allow that to happen to you, but on the other hand, don't be reactive to the fact that criticism is going to come, because it's a never-ending story if you get upset with every little thing that comes your way. Develop a certain amount of emotional calluses. Now, calluses can make us callous, and I don't want us to become that way. And I don't want us to become insensitive, but don't be overly sensitive. And I think many people, they become that way, and they then end up not putting themselves in any situation where criticism might come. I'm not going to do that because I'm afraid of it. And don't be afraid of it. Just be impersonal. Be not attached to it. Just like water washing over you. And if you can keep that attitude along with a cheerful smile and a cheerful attitude, whatever comes, you'll find it defeats everything, really. I used to go to government offices in the early days of Ananda, where that was my job, and public hearings where people would just rip me up, or rip Ananda up, and me by extension, giving their public comments because they didn't know anything, really. It was misinformation, but something they had read in a newspaper or something. And I learned that a smile and a chuckle and a gracious reply won the audience, or won the audience, but more importantly, won the people that were making the public decisions at those meetings. And one time, notably, after one of those meetings, one of the supervisors of the county came up to me afterwards and says, I was really impressed with how you handled that tonight. And I says, oh yeah, I've gotten to the point where I'm somewhat used to it by now. And he says, well, just let me tell you that every application comes in here that's of any note is going to have a flurry of people coming in and criticizing them. And I watch for how people react to that. And I want to compliment you on how you reacted. And he was not just complimenting me, he was complimenting Ananda in general, because he says, you people are just so centered, and you don't react to that stuff. And he says, I want you to know, in other words, telling me, I want you to know how much all of us here sitting in those dais and on that platform making decisions appreciate it. And that was behind the scenes. He couldn't say that publicly. And we ended up winning most of those battles in the end because of that. Just how we behaved ourselves in the face of opposition. And this is so we're talking about strategy to how to win the big battle, not the momentary little ups and downs that happen. Just go with it, absorb it. You're strong enough to be able to do that. But look for the big, it's the big battle of life that we're really speaking about here. And the right attitude wins in the end. God bless you.